glasses off to read my note. I'm still too vain to get bifocals.
Yeah.
Let's see. All right, I've gotten the signal. Thank you, Mike. Welcome to the Miller Center. My name is Russell Riley. I am a professor here at the center and am the co-chair of the Presidential Oral History Program at the center. And I'm glad to see you here, and you're in for a treat today. We're pleased to have with us our good friend, Professor Stephen Knott. Steve earned his PhD at Boston College and is currently a professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. And evidently it was as cold here today as it was in Newport when he left, which was some shock to Steve on his arrival. I also understand, and I want to make sure, you also have, this still has military rank associated with it or not?
No.
No.
Wish.
You wish. Now, but you were at the Air Force Academy for a while, and
right.
was there rank
No,
there?
I wish.
All right. Well, this
I always wanted a sword.
Understood. So this just goes to show you that we should have these conversations before I get on mic rather than getting up here. In any event, you can tell through the good-natured banter that Steve Knott is somebody who is familiar to us here at the Miller Center. For those of you who have a more recent association with the center, I will tell you that Steve Knott was Barbara Perry before Barbara Perry was Barbara Perry here, and that Steve was previously my colleague in the oral history program, and that means he's one of the few people that I will actually hug on greeting them at the center who comes in to speak. That's not considered decent behavior under normal circumstances, but our friendship goes back a long way. He is a beloved and esteemed colleague, and we've spent many, many hours together at the interview table and in travels back and forth, including a memorable 5 days in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, with former Vice President Dick Cheney doing interviews seated around his dining room table in his residence there. Those interviews are not yet cleared for public release, but we anticipate fairly shortly, given the fact that the Bush project has been opened, that those will be released, and we're very much looking forward to them. But you can find Steve Knott's work not just in his published materials, but importantly, I think, in these oral history interviews. He is a consummate interviewer, somebody who is terrifically well informed, but has also a terrific ear, and we're delighted to have him here. In fact, on the very first page of his introduction to the book that he's going to be talking about today, The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, he acknowledges his prior association with the center, and we're delighted to have that acknowledgement and to have him a part of our extended and continuing family. The other thing that I will say is that in addition to the oral history work, the Miller Center has a long tradition, reaching back to its founding period, of serious studies about the American presidency in the constitutional system, not just the interiors of presidential behavior that we deal with on a routine basis, but what the role of the presidency is in the American constitutional system. And I'm very pleased to tell you that this current book fits into what I think is an exceptional tradition of scholarship on the presidency and the constitutional system that goes back to our founding period. For those of you who know something about the deep study of American politics, the names of people like Herbert Storing, or Jeffrey Toulis, or James Caesar, or Fred Greenstein, All of those are people who had past associations with the center and did important work on the role of the presidency in the constitutional system. And I'm pleased to say that this book fits neatly into that tradition. And I think we're all in for a treat in hearing Steve talk about this work. And we'll give you an opportunity to pose questions yourself after he's finished. And I'll do a little back and forth before we get to that. So with no further ado, I present Steve Knott to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Justin. Thank you.
I'm not hugging you.
Well, thank you all for being here. It really is, it's a great feeling to come back here. This really is something of a second home. In fact, I used to live literally in the backyard in Hedge House, it's called. It was considered faculty housing at the time. I'm not sure what its status is today. But, and actually one night I came home, I flew home from New England, left my keys in my baggage. My baggage was lost. Got back here, all locked up at Hedge House, so I spent the night in the Miller Center sleeping. So this really was my home for a time. Thank you, Russell. You're always a gentleman, and I consider you a great friend, and it's great to see you again. It's good to see some familiar faces. Katrina Kuhn. Is Rob Martin here? No? Where's Rob? Brian Craig, great to see you. Mike Greco as well. Thank you, Mike. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of my book, and then we can get into some questions, as Russell mentioned. And I want to make it clear, this book is very critical of President Trump. I'll put that right up front. But this book was not written for the purpose of slamming Donald Trump. In fact, I began thinking about this project back in 2012 because it was my belief that the presidency has been on an unsustainable path. The sort of constant raising of expectations that presidential candidates engage in, and usually followed by some feeling of letdown on the part of his supporters. So we seem to be locked into this kind of endless cycle of heightened expectations followed by dashed hopes. And I'm going to lay out to you why I think that long predates Donald Trump or any of the contemporary presidents that you and I are all familiar with. Now, I will begin by saying that President Trump, in my view, is the kind of person that Alexander Hamilton and some of the other framers warned about in terms of being a demagogue who, as Hamilton would put it, practiced the little arts of popularity. And he does so, I believe, for the purpose of firing up his base. He is also, I believe, unfortunately, a purveyor of conspiracy theories. I think he lacks a certain magnanimity of soul, if you will. And I think there's a tendency to not distinguish between himself and the office that he temporarily holds. But again, you can see elements of this, perhaps in a less glaring light, in some of President Trump's predecessors. So let me outline to you why I think we reached this point, how we got to this long road to the Trump presidency. And I'm taking a little bit of a risk here saying this in Charlottesville, Virginia, but I believe the seeds to this sort of populist, semi-demagogic presidency were first planted by Thomas Jefferson. I may have to run out the back door here, but in his Revolution of 1800, as he called it. And Jefferson launched the American presidency on, as I said, a populist course that in the long run undermined the intentions of the framers of the Constitution. Excuse me. While many members of the founding generation were worried that a demagogue, and by that I mean Hamilton, Washington, James Madison, Jefferson's good friends, were worried that a demagogue might manipulate, public passions, and thereby possibly weaken or ultimately destroy the public, Jefferson argued that public opinion was the best criterion, as he put it, of what is best. And enlisting and engaging that opinion would give strength to the American government, Jefferson believed. And so the president, as the nation's only nationally elected figure, should root in some ways, his authority his legitimacy in popular support. And in so doing, that would allow him to serve as kind of a spokesman for and implementer of the majority's wishes. So Jefferson turns his rival Alexander Hamilton's arguments on its head. Jefferson argues that popular opinion confers constitutional legitimacy on the president. Hamilton argued exactly the opposite. Hamilton believed that it was the president's job to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, whether that's contrary to public opinion or not. And Jefferson, again, I could stand up here and cite quote after quote after quote. I won't do that, but Jefferson made it abundantly clear in a letter he once wrote to James Madison that it was, quote, his principle that the will of the majority should always prevail. And so, in essence, the majority was to govern, not the Constitution. And I argue in the book that Thomas Jefferson paved the way for Andrew Jackson. And granted, there were tremendous differences between Jefferson and Jackson. Jefferson was remarkably well-read and had a remarkable variety of interests. You can't really say the same about Jackson. But Jackson did share Jefferson's belief that the fundamental principle of the American government was that the majority is to rule. And so, again, just to reiterate, this is a complete rejection of the thinking of Madison, Hamilton, Washington, many of the other framers who believed instead in a system that refined public opinion, or maybe you could use the word filtered public opinion. And you can see those filtering elements in the Constitution with things like judicial review. At the time, indirect election of senators. U.S. senators were chosen by state legislators. Even the Electoral College itself. And Jackson believed, by the way, that the Electoral College should be abolished because it represented, as he put it, a perversion of the principle that as few impediments as possible should exist to the free operation of the public will. Now, the other aspect of Jackson's presidency that's important, and I would classify Jackson as a demagogue, is that Jackson played upon fears to mobilize his, what we would say today, his base. And no one understood this fact more clearly than John Quincy Adams, Jackson's opponent in 1824 and 1828, who was a target of Jackson's wrath, perhaps understandably, since the election of 1824. Jackson won the popular vote. But Jackson's wrath was also not just directed at Adams, it was also directed at abolitionists, at free blacks in the North, and at Native Americans. And so one of the main arguments of my book is that unpopular minorities, or groups that are out of step with the majority, tend to bear the brunt of this populist presidency. And John Quincy Adams, I think, recognized this. He was part of a dying breed who understood the threat that the tyranny of the majority presented to the American body politic. And just one quote here from Adams regarding Jackson. Jackson, he said, was a man governed by passions rather than reason. He was a demagogue. So with Jackson's election to the presidency in 1828, and with the wider success of his movement throughout the country at the state and local level, the American Republic moved from a system designed to check this majority tyranny to one where an unfettered majority governed. And what they did at the state and local level was to use this power to disenfranchise free blacks, particularly in the North, and also to press for an expansion of slavery. And they also used their power at the state and federal levels to remove an equally unpopular minority from its midst, Native Americans. So the coalition that Andrew Jackson assembled was at bottom a cauldron of boiling partisan, racial, and class resentments. And in Jackson's case, all of those elements plus decades of personal resentments thrown into the mix. He engaged in multiple duels throughout his life. In fact, spent the bulk of his life walking around with a bullet in his chest from one of those duels. 30 years later, I grant you I'm taking a this is a wide sweep of history here. Andrew Jackson's fellow Tennessean, Andrew Johnson, considered Andrew Jackson, sorry for all the Andrews, to be his ideal of a president. And you will see Andrew Johnson in the post-Civil War era stir this same populist pot on his path to power, particularly within Tennessee, where he held major positions throughout his career. And I argue in the book that Andrew Johnson is the closest we have to a kind of 19th century version of Donald Trump. So the refounded presidency of Jefferson and Jackson was embraced by, ironically enough, many 20th century progressives. Less so Teddy Roosevelt, but certainly Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt. And while Jefferson and Jackson did not believe in an activist federal government, these progressive presidents did. And I argue in the book that while Jefferson and Jackson would be opposed to a lot of the sort of 20th century progressive agenda, the creation of a modern social welfare state, the modern administrative state, they did share something in common, and that was this belief that the president spoke for the majority. And the president was uniquely situated to see the whole of the country, unlike senators or congressmen. And thus, if the people demanded a federal government that could be as big as it wanted to be, in other words, the creation of this modern welfare state, so be it. And it would be led by a president who was as big a man as he wanted to be. And that, by the way, is almost a direct quote from Woodrow Wilson. Wilson argued that, as did TR, there should be very little restraints on what the president should do, particularly if the majority demanded. And so I think, again, you can see even further erosion here of any sort of restraints on presidential conduct, and also a further escalation in what the public thought the federal government would be capable of doing, and in particular what the presidency could accomplish. And so TR, Wilson, FDR, later JFK, will fuel these heightened expectations, which I believe has contributed to the cynicism, at best skepticism, that we see today regarding the competence of the federal government or of the presidency itself. So progressive politicians such as Franklin Roosevelt, along with a number of academics, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Henry Steele Commager, and others, viewed Andrew Jackson as a precursor to Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And thus you have books by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. talking about the age of Jackson and drawing parallels to FDR and the New Deal. And while Jackson and FDR may have been a century apart, both men fought the elites of their day and considered themselves to be the voice of the people. And as with Jackson, and this gets a little touchy here, I think, for some folks, but as with Jackson, FDR was a genius at firing up his base by labeling his opponents as un-American evildoers. And so the book then goes on to trace every American president from FDR to the present, with particular emphasis on John F. Kennedy, which may come as a surprise. He's only president for 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days. But he left a remarkable impact on the office and on the American psyche. And part of that was Kennedy's ability to use television, the new medium of television, just as FDR had used radio. Kennedy uses television. But also Kennedy pledges the United States government, I argue, to a series of unsustainable, undeliverable goals, if you will, that this country will bear any burden, oppose any force that seeks to tyrannize the rest of the world. So we've got this grandiose foreign policy objectives announced by Kennedy in his inaugural address, and also, I would argue, grandiose domestic objectives announced by both Kennedy and Johnson. The Johnson administration, for instance, pledged that poverty in the United States would be eliminated by 1975. And again, this refounded presidency, I argue in the book, placed the office on a dangerous and unsustainable path, a path of heightened expectations that encourages in addition to what I've already mentioned, these unsustainable promises, it also encourages a contempt for checks and balances. And this is another big theme in the book, it diminished the unifying role that the president was expected to play as head of state. We've almost lost that sense, and that's part of the reason for the title, The Lost Soul of the American Presidency. George Washington envisioned the president as being a unifying figure, as being somebody who would, as best as possible, stay above the partisan fray. Now, I grant you political parties hadn't developed yet. I understand all the evolutions that occurred that forced the president to become a partisan leader, but I think we could make some incredible progress in terms of restoring the prestige of the office and of the American government writ large if the president returned to playing that role as head of state and downplayed his role as party leader and policy formulator, which makes him a partisan lightning rod. And all of this, I argue in the book, has contributed to an erosion of respect for the office. So in the end, the book is a plea for a kind of return to the constitutional presidency envisioned by Washington, Hamilton, and Madison. This was a presidency of sober expectations, not unlimited promise-making, one that did not pander to or manipulate the public, and one that was averse to the notion that it was the president's job to provide a vision for all of us to follow into the promised land. That was a big aspect of Woodrow Wilson's conception of the presidency. And perhaps most importantly, if we were to return to that constitutional presidency, perhaps there would be fewer examples of implementing the majority will at the expense of political, racial, and economic minorities. Now, I grant you the prospects of return to the office as I conceive it are slim. You know, we could hold a convention in a phone booth of people who might agree entirely with everything I'm saying here. But if we could just at least begin the process, and part of that would require, I think, a renewed emphasis on civics education. I think the public, the American public shows, unfortunately, a lack of perhaps understanding of this earlier alternative, just a lack of understanding of some of the basics of how the federal government was intended to operate. It doesn't have to be that way. And if we could also instill some sense of fear of tyranny of the majority and get rid of this idea that the people are always right. I know that's kind of heresy to say, but we are so wedded to public opinion polls that I think it frequently leads our political figures astray. And so if we could return to a presidency that's respectful of the rule of law and appreciative of the role of the president of head of state, rather than a full-time rabble-rouser, we would make considerable progress. Now, this would require a renewed appreciation on the part of both presidents and the public for the limits of the office and the limits of politics. And I think a renewed appreciation for the fact that history is littered with examples, as Hamilton put it, of leaders who have overturned the liberties of republics. Hamilton repeatedly cites in the Federalist Papers the dangers presented to republics by demagogues. So those are some of the main themes in the book. I think I'd just as soon turn to having a discussion both with Russell and with you, so thank you for your attention.
Give you a chance to get a swallow
Sure.
of water there.
Thank you.
All right, I'll talk with Steve for a little while and be formulating your questions because I want to make sure we have ample opportunity before we close for you to ask your questions. This is a thought-provoking book, and some provocative in many ways, particularly in a place like Charlottesville. If you're going to go after Mr. Jefferson, then there's no better place to do it than here. So I'm sure you'll get a lot of questions. Because you did this. Congratulations, you hit your mark of 20 minutes. So Christina will be delighted. You went over a lot of, or sailed over a lot of details that I think probably are relevant and certainly fascinating. One thing is that there are some 20th century presidents, at least, that you say, actually did the job right in the face of historical trends which tend in the opposite direction. Two of whom were Taft and Gerald Ford.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth, this is a little bit of a softball question, but it gives you an opportunity to come to the defense of two presidents who often aren't spoken about and defended, but also because it gives you an opportunity to illuminate a little bit more your theory about what works and what doesn't work in the presidency.
Great. Well, terrific question, terrific point. Yeah, I have a lot of positive things to say about William Howard Taft, which is somewhat unusual. In fact, I think I argued at one point that we should sandblast Mount Rushmore and put Taft up there, if he would fit. I don't know if he would. Poor Taft. Taft is, of course, as I say, sandwiched between Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, two progressive giants and two people who really did contribute to this overturning of the constitutional presidency. Taft did not. And so Taft remained, I would say, respectful of separation of powers, checks and balances, the rule of law. He refused to engage in what he saw as TR's kind of media antics. He kept a low profile as president, tried to act with dignity, for lack of a better word. But at the same time, he pursued very progressive policies. And there's a few stats in the book about more successful antitrust legislation passed during Taft's time than during TR's time. So one can pursue, I think, a progressive policy agenda while at the same time not trashing the Constitution or the notion of the rule of law. And Taft did it. Now he was defeated resoundingly in 1912 because he refused to engage in what Hamilton called the little arts of popularity. He wouldn't do it. And, in my view, I think he deserves high marks for conducting himself in a manner consistent with the framers' vision of how the presidency should operate. I do say positive things about President Ford as well. Ford was well aware of his rhetorical limitations. As he put it, he was a Ford, not a Lincoln. And he, and politically, the House and the Senate were just stacked against him. So it's not as if he could have announced some grand vision for the country. But he made it clear that visions were not his thing. We never used to expect presidents to have a vision. And this is only about 100 years plus old. This is Wilson and TR saying, no, the president needs to enunciate a vision and to bring the masses with him. And Ford rejects that notion out of hand. And I would argue it costs him as well. There are a number of other factors as well that leads to his defeat. The other president I have something positive to say about is Eisenhower. Now, I apologize. Those are three Republicans. So I hope this isn't coming off as too partisan, because I'm certainly very hard on Richard Nixon and Donald Trump. But I do have positive things to say about Dwight Eisenhower. He comes the closest in terms of modern presidents. I'm old enough to say I was born during the Eisenhower years, so I think of that as modern. He also, I think, understood the benefits that can come from playing that head of state role. And he tried to stay above the partisan fray. And he had a very good relationship, for instance, with the majority leader, Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat. He never engaged in personal assaults on his political opponents and was irritated when his subordinates did that. So this is not a man who practices the politics of personal destruction at all. He is, in many ways, the anti-Trump. And I think we could learn a lot from Taft, from Ford, and perhaps particularly from Eisenhower's way of conducting the office.
Steve, when I was a graduate student, we were always told in our political theory classes, the United States is not a democracy. It wasn't intended to be a democracy. That every time you use the phrase democracy in the context of our form of government, that it comes with a modifier. We're a liberal democracy, or we're a constitutional democracy, or we are a democratic republic. And I think part of what you're arguing is that not only do you support the idea that there is an amalgam in our form of government, but that importantly the presidency has a particular role in the non-democratic aspects of those modifiers, both in the protection of liberalism as we understand it theoretically, not in the sense of Donald Trump owning the libs, but the presidency has a role in protecting constitutionalism, in protecting republicanism. And let me throw that out there for you to reflect on and maybe to tell us a bit how that argument is embedded in your book.
Yeah, it is. So part of the president's constitutional obligations under Article 2 is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Mm-hmm. And that's going to put him sometimes, I think, at odds with the will of the majority. And again, if you shift the office, if you no longer ground it in this sort of constitutional foundation and you shift it over to the realm of public opinion and to the majority will, then you put that notion of the rule of law at risk. And that's precisely what Hamilton was concerned about when he saw Jefferson refounding the presidency during his revolution of 1800. So the president is, in a sense, the chief law enforcement officer of the federal government. It's his responsibility, as I said, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. If he lives up to his constitutional oath, that's just a fact that's going to put him, I would argue at times, it's going to put him in opposition to what the public may want. But that's the job of the president, not the spokesman for the majority, not the implementer of the majority's will. But as you said, Russell, I do see him as one of the, or eventually her, as one of the guardians of the Constitution and of the rule of law.
I live very close to Montpelier, and I sometimes have trouble sleeping at night because I can feel James Madison spinning in his grave there. But I have sometimes thought that, based on my reading of the Federalist Papers, that Hamilton and Madison would not have been surprised that Donald Trump could become president, somebody who's disruptive in this way. But I think they would have been surprised that somebody like Mitch McConnell would be the Senate Majority Leader.
Yeah.
Let me get you as somebody who's thought a lot about the founding principles to respond to that assertion.
I think it's an accurate assertion, and they probably would have been surprised about a Harry Reid as well. Mm-hmm. So I think the hope was, and they're explicit about this in the Federalist Papers, Congress is going to protect its turf. It's going to protect its turf against executive and arguably judicial encroachments on their power. Unfortunately, the development of parties and party discipline, and also Woodrow Wilson and TR's arguments that the president has to serve as the sort of de facto leader of his majority party in Congress, that gets rid of that important check that, instead of now protecting one's legislative turf, one now feels obligated to follow the marching orders of the president if he's from your own party. Now that is, again, another one of those erosions of the whole system of checks and balances. So I think you're right. I think both Hamilton and Madison, particularly Hamilton, had a jaded view of human nature and would not have been surprised, perhaps, that we have elected. Look, I've got to be careful what I say about President Trump. I work for the Department of Defense, so I need to put out a disclaimer here that what I'm saying here today is completely my own opinions, not the Department of Defense, not the Department of the Navy, not the Naval War College. This is just me. I should have said that earlier. You know, I think they would have expected somebody like a Trump or Nixon, or take your pick. But they did hope that Congress would protect its turf. And instead, the notion that the president is expected to be the partisan leader of his, eventually hers, majority in Congress they would not have approved of this. And I think they were on to something. So we've seen it. I argue in the book, by the way, I'm very critical of President Clinton. And I was actually going to tell Russell to skip that part. But I'm very critical of President Clinton because I think you saw in his impeachment scenario party discipline at work in a not necessarily helpful way. I'm not necessarily arguing that President Clinton should have been impeached, but I guess I would have liked to have seen a little bit more independence on the part of some members of Congress in terms of at least condemning the president's actions. But you see that party discipline in the Clinton case, and you're seeing it perhaps tenfold today in the Trump case. No matter what evidence is produced, at least to date, members of Congress from Trump's party seem to be unwilling to break with him. And that's, I think, one of the results, a bad result of the sort of Wilsonian conception of the president as party leader and, in a sense, de facto leader of the House and Senate.
Let me ask you about how you situate the presidency in broader cultural trends and broader historical trends. And one of the arguments that can be made in defense of a more popularized presidency is the defensive nature of the presidency in bringing those democratic impulses into the government itself as a way of disarming demagoguery in the population at large. So that one of the best examples of this would be Franklin Roosevelt's second New Deal. Part of the argument about Roosevelt's second New Deal, which was a step far beyond the first New Deal, after he'd been in office for 3 or 4 years, was that the movement towards the adoption of Social Security, for example, and even court packing was done as a defensive measure against people like Charles Coughlin and Huey Long and others who were out revving the population up to get the political order to move in a direction that was clearly destructive, and that a presidency operating within a constitutional system can have the effect of disarming this dangerous impulses in the popular system. Over the course of history, this has become more and more problematic because we are able to be more democratic. At the time of Jefferson's era, you didn't have television, you didn't have Facebook, you didn't have the internet. Now all of these things make it possible for anybody, President Trump's famous 400-pound guy sitting on his bed, to have an impact on the political system in a way that was impossible. So the technology has moved in ways that also create additional danger. So isn't there something fundamentally conservative about moving this popular frame of leadership into the government and pulling it out of the population at large?
Great point, and a terrific point. And I did find myself having to wrestle with the points that you just made, particularly in the chapter dealing with Franklin Roosevelt. I was trying to walk, and I think I succeeded, a fine line between crediting Roosevelt, and I do credit him, with taking steps that ensured that the United States did not follow the path of many European countries who took a fascist or a communist turn. And I'm one of these, I'm actually fairly politically conservative, but I'm constantly arguing with my friends to make the case that FDR saved American capitalism. And I believe that. And the same as also with his actions in terms of sort of gearing the country up to prepare for the Second World War. So there's a lot about Franklin Roosevelt that I admire. And so I do take that point. I would still argue in the end that, for instance, Taft serves as an example of somebody who pursued relatively progressive policies without trashing the Constitution. And Franklin Roosevelt at the time, I think, came very close to trashing the Constitution. He actually argued in the midst of that court packing plan that it was inappropriate for the Supreme Court to be dissenting from the will of the American people. You know, he referred to it, the federal government, as a three-horse team. Mm-hmm. You got two horses moving in the right direction, but you get this one horse, the judiciary, that keeps stopping. And that's got to stop. They've got to get marching in lockstep with the elected branches of government. That is a complete reversal of, I think, the genius of our system, which is designed to make sure that we avoid situations where a majority becomes tyrannical. But again, I take your point. There is an argument to be made, particularly in the case of FDR, that he did serve as kind of a valve, kind of draining. You know, we didn't end up with Huey Long. Yeah. We didn't end up with Father Coughlin. Yeah. And God bless him for that.
Yeah. Well, I had years ago had written something on Andrew Jackson making basically the same point. You wonder what the American political system would have looked like, what American politics would have looked like had they managed to keep Jackson out of the presidency. Yeah. Was he a greater danger to the American to the United States at the time as a sort of rabble-rousing outsider than having him inside, where at least the forms of the Constitution constrained him somewhat, and he felt ownership for what the government was doing at the time.
Again, a terrific point. Jackson's a good case, I think, of somebody who did, at least his movement, the Jacksonian movement, the Democratic Party of that time. To me, it's a perfect example of the tyranny of the majority at work. As I mentioned briefly in my talk, both towards free blacks, particularly in the North, where the Democratic Party began a policy of disenfranchising them as fast as they could, including in places like New York, his vice president, Martin Van Buren's home state, where they raised a massive poll tax on free blacks that did not exist for white males. So the flip side to a presidency that is so responsive and arguably serves that valve, what's the word I'm groping for here, that draining function. The flip side is that a lot of time minorities who are out of step with that majority pay a steep price. Yeah. And in Jackson's case, you saw it with the disenfranchising of free blacks, and obviously with the treatment of Native Americans within the boundaries of the United States at that time. So again, I believe that the president does have a role to play in terms of being something of a national teacher. And I point out instances. Lincoln's a great example. I even give Kennedy credit for his civil rights speech of June '63. There are times when the president has to speak out, but the times that I see him having to speak out are times when he needs, I think, to correct the problems with, or to at least try to enlighten the majority about the impact these policies have on these minorities who are out of step.
Mm-hmm. You talk to some extent in the book about the episodes of emergency power. How does that fit into the model?
Yeah, so the last time I was here, I actually spoke I wrote a book defending George W. Bush's actions in the war on terror. Probably just lost half the audience with that statement. But I know I lost people in my own family when that book came out. But I'm from Massachusetts, and defending George W. Bush is like defending, But I do argue in the book, I would still argue, I thought Bush's actions in the war on terror were at least constitutionally defensible. We can get into that if you want.
Yeah, I'm going to have to
Yeah.
insist. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm not arguing in this book, as some libertarian critics of the presidency would, that we need to pull the president back from some of his foreign and national security powers. That's not what this book is about. I am somebody who believes that Article 2 does, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States, actually means something, and it means something in extraordinary instances. It may mean suspending habeas corpus in the midst of a civil war, for instance. I would defend those kinds of actions, and I'm not arguing for that kind of rollback or restriction, as some libertarian critics would. I'm arguing more for this kind of, again, this populist presidency that seems to have a disregard for, at times, the rights of minorities and just a complete disregard for the rule of law. I realize that's a difficult argument to make, because if you're a real stickler for the notion of the rule of law, then you may be troubled by some of the actions of a Lincoln or an FDR or George W. Bush in the war on terror. But I think I try to make that argument stick in the book.
Let me ask one more before I turn it over to the audience, and that is, you have a prognosis for the future? I've just made the mistake of submitting a paper proposal for the Political Studies Association meeting in Edinburgh in April with the title Reimagining the Post-Trump Presidency. And I need your help in trying to figure out how I'm going to write this paper.
I will be, so as I said, I'm a New Englander. New Englanders are pretty bleak. I don't know if it was too many years of watching the Red Sox collapse or what the reason, although they've turned things around. I'll be blunt. My publisher said, could you put something on at the end that's a little bit, that offers some hope for the future? And actually, I'm glad that he suggested that. I do think, unfortunately, the history of the presidency shows that once you destroy certain norms and traditions, they don't come back. And so I am very concerned about what the future holds, and that we could end up with Donald Trump squared, either on either party, in either party. I do offer some suggestions in terms of presidential selection, and this is not particularly innovative, and I'm certainly not the first to say this. I think superdelegates need to be restored to both political parties. You had a situation in 2016 where Bernie Sanders, who's not even a member of the Democratic Party, almost won the nomination of that party. And in the Republican Party, you had a person who seems to have been voting, if he voted as a Democrat, winning the Republican nomination. That's crazy. So I'm a believer in, to some extent, returning to the old smoke-filled room. Now, again, I know that the odds of that are probably slim, but if you really want to weed out candidates who I would argue are not up to the job of president, we need some filtering function other than public opinion, other than being able to manipulate the public through the little arts of popularity. And that's where we are today. And we're going to keep getting that unless we restore the power of elected, congressmen, senators, mayors, the party leadership to play some role in picking people who are actually capable of being president. That's what we had in the 19th century, by the way. I mean, we had a lot of mediocrities, arguably, but they didn't do any damage. I'll take a mediocre candidate any day over somebody who does damage. And so you can be critical of the smoke-filled rooms, but you could be critical of Benjamin Harrison or some of these other no-names. But again, I would argue they did not do damage. Some of our more modern presidents, I would argue, have done damage. So superdelegates, and what I mentioned very briefly, which was I do a lot of seminars with high school history teachers. I would love to see a renewed emphasis on civics, just on the basics of American government. I work with a great program in Ohio through the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University, teaching high school history teachers. I think 33% of the American public can name all three branches of government. And I could sit up here and give you it's mind-boggling. So I think ultimately the American public needs to get over its fascination with charismatic television personalities, and that's not just a shot at Trump. There are others. John Kennedy sort of fits that bill. One way I hope, or I think, to possibly do that is to restore civics education, restore an appreciation for separation of powers and checks and balances, and restore an appreciation for the rule of law.
Yeah, it's a really hard proposition to try to communicate in a democratic age the virtues of republicanism.
It is.
Because it requires people to divest themselves of some of their ability to influence politics, and you have to make a compelling argument for why it's needed, which I think you managed to do in this book. So we have a microphone here, and if you have a question, let us know so that we can get the mic to you and you can pose your question to Steve, and our audience in the great internet ether can hear what your question is. So, right, yes, okay, thank you.
Very interesting discussion of your book.
Yes.
I just want to ask you a question. You mentioned about the president, Jefferson, Jackson, primarily advocating for the majority. But in fact, today, we have a situation where, let's say Trump wins re-election, he could lose the popular vote by 5 million votes.
Yeah.
So he's really not representing the majority as far as the popular vote. And with this migration from rural areas to more urban and suburban areas, you're really representing a minority of the population. Would you comment on that?
Sure. It's a very valid point. I would simply say that last night I watched a little bit of the Democratic candidates debate, not much, but some, and I think it was last. Steyer, the billionaire candidate, saying we need to get rid of the Electoral College. We need to democratize. I don't think that's worked. I mean, we've been engaging in this experiment now for at least 100 years. I argue all the way back to Jefferson. I want to see us restore some of those Republican elements. Thus, I'm in favor of keeping the Electoral College. But you're right. I mean, we've had two instances now in this century alone of popular vote losers becoming president, and that seems to run counter to what I'm saying. But I'd say those are the exception, not the rule, that generally speaking, the candidate who engages in those little arts of popularity, and Trump's a good example, tends to prevail. I know he lost big time thanks to California. I actually agree with you. I think he's got a good chance of winning next year, but losing in the popular vote even worse than last time, because I think California's going to come out in droves to vote against him. But again, the thrust has been towards democratizing the process. I'm very leery of attempts to further democratize this, because I think it's leading us down the wrong path.
Next, please.
Thank you for this really wonderful overview. I'm thinking back to last week. We had a program about the American Creed and the attempt to create this kind of sense of a popular view of America. And what I was wondering then, and still wonder now, if maybe something that would help this situation is finding ways through the civic history or other elements where we give minorities, like American Indians, Muslims, African Americans, a chance to express themselves and be more of a powerful presence in our American creed. That it seems like I'm just really wanting to find some hopeful way to move us through this, and if you could comment on that.
Yeah. This, I don't know how helpful what I'm about to say will be, but I do think part of the problem is that we in this country have politicized everything and nationalized everything. They're really, Tip O'Neill once said that all politics is local. I don't know if that's even true anymore. I mean, maybe it is really if you get right down to the township level. But we've nationalized our congressional races. Newt Gingrich was explicit about that in 1994. Presidential candidates and presidents are expected to comment on everything from school uniforms to, the latest internet meme or something. I mean, it's just, and so somehow we need to depoliticize, denationalize, return more power, more authority to the local and state level. Now, I recognize the history of that is not, it's a pretty checkered one as well. But I would think there perhaps is a chance for minority groups of any kind, political, religious, economic, perhaps to have more clout at the state and local level than they are in this enormous behemoth that we've created. That's the best I can do, and I realize it's an insufficient answer.
First, I'm Dick Ruffin. First, just a comment on vision.
Yeah.
And then a question. My comment on vision is that don't have to be catering to the demagogues. Kennedy's greatest vision was get a man on the moon in 10 years. And nobody wanted it, but he pushed it through. So that's a good example of vision. Now, my question really follows on the comment about the loss of power at different junctures in our democracy where power used to be strong. For example, committee chairs. They really ran the show. And they were based on seniority. And that's gone. Well, today, one of the things that, I don't want you to comment on the candidates in detail, but I'm interested in, we have 2 mayors who are up there. We have 1 or 2 others who are not flamboyant, appealing to the masses. They're trying to be sober and restrained.
Fair enough.
Amy Klobuchar is an example of that. So there's also a lot that's positive happening at the local level, all across America, and it's being well documented. And so I'm encouraged by local action that's happening, and hope that might be a kind of turning point for the country, that we take power away from the national figures and give it more to the local figures. Do you see any hope of that?
Well, you made a very, who are the 2 mayors? I know Buttigieg.
Booker and
Booker, yeah, okay. All right.
2 Rhodes Scholars and 2 mayors.
Look, I mean, I think you certainly are seeing a reaction within the Democratic Party to President Trump. But I mean, you're also seeing, Marianne Williamson, Tom Steyer. Again, I realize I'm harping on the negative here. There are some folks on that stage who shouldn't even be there. And again, if the Democratic Party leadership had the power it once had, they wouldn't be there. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a plus. I know that goes against, again, this grain of open, everything needs to be open, everybody needs to have their say. So at the national level, again, I would tighten things up in terms of the nominating process at the presidential level. I'm trying to be hopeful. I do see signs of a reaction to Trumpism, for lack of a better word. And I got to be honest with you, I actually thought, when I first started thinking about this, I actually thought a Trump-like figure would more likely emerge in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. And the reason I say that is that the Democratic Party was much more aggressive in the 20th century and into this century in terms of trying to democratize the presidential selection process. The McGovern reforms of, 70, 71 or so. So I thought they opened themselves up more to the possibility of a complete outsider, unequipped, in over his head. And it was the Republican Party that had a kind of, the Bushes, you kind of bided your time. Nixon's Eisenhower's vice president, then he gets to run, and then the whole Bush thing with Reagan, loyal vice president. Even Mitt Romney in 2012 was kind of the establishment candidate. I don't know what happened, but I guess they got tired of losing or something. But they adopted this notion of opening things up even more aggressively than the Democrats. So, look, I'm trying to be hopeful. I'm trying to be hopeful. And you are? Go ahead.
No, let me just step in with one comment on this, which is that if your goal is to restore something like the constitutional order more closely as it existed at the time it was framed, not go all the way back to that, but something that more closely approximates the forms of that constitutional order, it makes perfect sense for there to be an enormous degree of rescission of power back to states and localities, and that may be, maybe that's one hopeful area, and it actually could. That may be a place where the grander global and historical trends are working in that direction. If you look at the sort of separatist movements around the world and the sort of the fragmenting of authority, maybe that's a place where the restoration of authority to the states is following the tides of history rather than working against it in these grander democratic trends that you've been talking about that have been so deleterious in its effect on the constitutional presidency. I don't know.
Just in case these optimistic cases don't bear out, what are the implications of a second term of a demigod?
I'm not going to respond to that because I probably already said enough today to get me in trouble with my employer. So
It's not going to get better.
I doubt it. There's just been so many norms, and I think good norms and traditions that have just been beaten to death. Well, maybe they're not dead, but they're on their deathbed.
I'll step in because I don't have the same constraints as Steve does. I think the election is extraordinarily important because, boy, that's a surprise to anybody, right? But the point that I would make is one-term presidents tend not to have a very long tail end effect on the political system. That if you think back, who wanted to be Jimmy Carter after Jimmy Carter was turned out after 4 years? Nobody. The party turned away from him. The nation turned away from him. He has a splendid reputation as a post-president that's very well earned. But the Carter presidency was largely viewed as a failure because he was limited to one term. And so I think if you're looking for something hopeful, that if this particular president is limited to one term, it is possible, I'm not saying certain, but it's at least possible that we treat that presidency the same way that we have other single-term presidents. The same thing was true of George H.W. Bush, who is a beloved figure now, whose contributions to the international system are widely lauded, but nobody wanted to be George H.W. The Republican Party, including the people who were around his son and supporting his son, didn't want a replication of Bush 41. Bush 43 was going to be something entirely different. Why? Because he was a failure. He didn't get reelected. And that, I think, is why this coming election is so important, because it's an opportunity. If you don't like the way things are trending now, it's an opportunity not just to stop it, but to mark it forever in the history books as a failed presidency.
Thank you, Russell. Thanks for answering that.
You shouldn't have said that.
Let me join in the thanks of others for a terrific presentation. I can't wait to read the book. So let me push you on an issue which may feel uncomfortable, but give you a way to answer it, which is impeachment. Fiona Hill is testifying this morning. And based on what we heard about her testimony before it was actually happened, the prepared version, she's going to say that President Trump's policy toward Ukraine and Russia was disastrous. But impeachment in the founders was not supposed to be for maladministration. It was for treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanors. But the question that I put to you is, as you understand the Constitution and the role of the presidency, in foreign policy, is what the president himself decides, to use the president's word, absolute? Or do the recommendations of the staff and the administration, in some ways you're arguing for a more administrative, managerial presidency, do they have any bearing on this question? In this case, Congress authorized funds. Does the presidents have argued that signing statements give them some authority on how and when funds can be used? Help us understand, in the context of this current impeachment debate, how we should think about the president's foreign policy authority and whether or not Congress actually has a check on it.
Well, Congress certainly should have a check on it. And I think any time a president overtly defies a congressional edict of sorts, then you're in you're in a very dangerous area. And perhaps that's the point where civil servants have to step up and tell the truth. Again, I know I'm walking a very fine line here because I'm somebody who has defended, I just said to you earlier, I defended Bush in the war on terror. I defended some of Reagan's actions, which caused controversy. I'm a believer in this notion of prerogative power, that when the security of the country is at stake, the president is constitutionally obligated to act. He's the only member of the federal government who takes an oath. The oath is written right in the Constitution to preserve, protect, and defend it. And so I do see him, as Jefferson did, as Lincoln did, as FDR did, of having, at rare circumstances, dire circumstances like a civil war, having this emergency power to act hopefully in most cases where the law is silent, but even in extremely rare cases where against the written law. And so, for instance, Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, that's a power given to Congress, not the president. He, as he put it, I think he absorbed it for a brief period of time, and then they ratified it after the fact. I would defend that to the day I pass away. To me, he was doing his constitution, he was fulfilling his constitutional obligation to preserve, protect, and defend. And Jefferson's argument in favor of that kind of emergency power was, once the crisis has passed, then the president must throw himself into the court of public opinion. Say, look, I did action number X, whatever. It's contrary to the law, or I didn't have the legal authority to do it, but I'm throwing this, I'm giving you the evidence, the American people. You can decide whether I should be impeached or not. You can decide whether I should not be reelected or not. So there is a tradition in this country of presidents taking these extraordinary measures. It goes back to at least Jefferson. But the point Jefferson was making is that the action has to be in the national interest. It can't be to help you secure a re-election. He didn't say this, but it can't be for your own personal needs or agenda. It's got to be in the national interest. I realize it's kind of an ambiguous term, but I find it hard to believe. Well, you get my point. Some of the actions today I don't see in the national interest.
Bill, let me weigh in with a couple of things. First, I think it's extremely relevant that Richard Nixon almost got impeached for impounding funds that Congress had appropriated. Most people have forgotten that piece of history, that there was an active consideration of impeaching Nixon because he was doing something very much like this on a much grander scale. And ultimately, if I recall correctly, they decided not to have an article of impeachment on impoundment because there were so many other things that were more powerful. But there is a history for this. The second piece of this is that I'm sure that I'm not violating the confidences of an interview we did with John Yoo, who as a scholar and as a member of the Justice Department under George W. Bush's administration, one of the great accidents of history ended up being in the Justice Department at a time where President Bush needed authorization to do a lot of unusual things after 9/11. And John, you happen to be there. He is probably the most recognizable advocate of this notion of a unitary executive, which basically says all executive powers by the Constitution are invested in the president, which means whatever he says is the executive branch's argument, which means all of these little people out there who are claiming to be representative of our interest are actually acting contrary to the president's will, and therefore what they suggest is null and void. If you're a firm believer in that theory of a unitary executive. Importantly, though, if you follow Yu's teachings and his writings, the congressional role is as important as the presidential role because of the taxing and appropriating authority. And Yu's argument has always been, if Congress wants to get back at a president, if Congress wants to have an equal voice in the political system, it is to come through appropriations and taxing. Defund things you don't like. In this instance, in the way that you posed the question, it comes directly up against that core responsibility of Congress to appropriate and to see that those monies are expended in the way that they wanted them to. And I think that's a part of the contrary argument. We got time for a couple more questions. Yes? You got
Can I actually ask a question?
Sure.
Okay. So you talked about like vision as like some presidents now are elected with these supposedly unrealistic visions that aren't necessarily realized.
Frequently.
And part of that has to do with the fact that they have like a lot more of the legislative policy-making authority is within the executive branch rather than the legislative branch, which has also led to like a vast increase in the number of executive orders. I was just wondering if you see like that administrative aspect of the presidency, like the managerial presidency, ever going away, if like Congress is going to get a lot of that legislative authority making back, or is it going to like continue to be defined by the president?
So Congress has given that authority away over the decades, piece by piece by piece by piece, right? So there are some members of Congress who are determined to get that back, but I'd say they're very much in a distinct minority at this point. You have some Democrats who are skeptical of presidential war powers and intelligence matters. They want some of it back. And then you have like members of the House Freedom Caucus, Republicans, who want more of the domestic lawmaking power back that they've given over to the executive starting 100 or so years ago. Am I optimistic about that happening? No, I don't think so. One of the things I try to say in the book is that a lot of conservatives, as we're seeing now, today, have fallen in love with this populist, expansive presidency. Partly due to Ronald Reagan, who's a person I sort of admire. I did the Reagan oral history program when I was here and grew to admire Reagan, at least as a person. But conservatives fell in love with Reagan, I think, and fell in love with aspects of this kind of populist presidency that, again, I think is somewhat destructive. So am I optimistic? No, because I don't see yet, and I don't even see on the horizon, anything approaching a consensus to pull those powers back and for Congress to stand up and protect its prerogatives.
One more question? There was one up here. Okay, please, go ahead.
Yeah, just a question on the unitary executive theory.
Yeah.
It seems that where our current president has seized on this to turn it into, if the president does it, it's legal. And I guess I need a better understanding of the unitary executive theory. Does it actually evolve into that kind of statement?
I'm going to throw that over to you.
You're going to throw it to me since I raised the issue?
You're the one who raised it.
I will tell you, my own personal sense is that in some respects, Steve is arguing that Donald Trump is the inevitable product of a system of increased democratization over time. I would make a sort of competing argument that he's the inevitable product of the theory of a unitary executive. That I think that there is a certain elegance in the model because it simplifies an awful lot of things, but I don't think the framers of the American Constitution built a simple model. That it was the model of separated institutions sharing powers was derided at the time as a heterogeneous phantom by some critics. It was neither fish nor fowl. There was no easy way to say what presidential power was as opposed to congressional power, because all of these things were interlaced and interlocked. And my own thinking is that the unitary executive is oversimplified. That there's a certain elegance in the model. And again, in having conversations with somebody like John Yoo over a period of days, he's a smart guy, and he's not, I think, a strict ideologue. I just think in this matter, we have a difference of opinion about what the intentions of the framers were about this. And again, in my own thinking, I think the reason the framers didn't embrace the theory of a unitary executive in the simple model was exactly because this would be the ultimate conclusion of it. They did not have a very they did not have a very cheerful notion of human nature. Hamilton certainly didn't have a very cheerful notion of human nature. Politics was populated by human beings, and probably power would attract those who were power hungry and could be prone to excess. So what you do is you guard against it. And the theory, to me, a theory of a unitary executive is an invitation to empower somebody who would feel no qualms about exercising those authorities if they were granted. I would encourage you, if you haven't done so, you should go and look at the interview we did with William Barr. I think this was before your time, Steve. It was done in April of 2001. I went back and looked at that because Barr has given a couple of speeches in the last couple of weeks that have gotten a lot of attention, that surprised people in terms of his vigorous defense of this theory of a unitary executive. It's all in that interview. You can go look at that. He, at the time, thinking he was going to be forever out of public life, was very direct in terms of his assessment of where things were. The striking thing about Barr was, again, the interview was done 4 or 5 months before 9/11, and I wonder whether that interview would have been very different if it had been conducted after 9/11, because his concerns were about the limits of presidential power, and he still seems to be very much fixated on limits to presidential power in an age where that doesn't seem to be our number one problem as a constitutional system. I should not have the last word. I should give you the last word.
Well, one of the power-hungry individuals that Hamilton feared was Thomas Jefferson, so why don't we end on that happy note?
Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Rob.
Well done. There are copies of the book outside. I read the entire thing on airplane trips on the last week or so, and I can highly commend it. So please buy a copy. They're wonderful.